We're starting the next unit today on the nervous system, and this is one of my favorite systems to teach about. And in this unit, we're going to cover the anatomy of a neuron. We're going to talk about how does a neuron actually send information from one part of the body to the other, and we're going to talk a little bit about the functioning of neurons. And then we have a whole second unit, an entire separate unit on the brain and spinal cord. So we're going to be spending some time on the nervous system, which makes sense because it's a really important system. It is what allows these trillions of cells in our body to somehow work together as one unit. So let's get started. When you think of the nervous system, you really should be thinking of a specific type of tissue, right? So we talked about the fact that there are four major types of tissue in the human body. There's epithelial tissue. Connective tissue is what makes up most of the tissues in the human body. Then we just spent the last couple weeks talking about the muscular system, so that's muscle tissue. And then finally we have our nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is extremely specialized to really do one job. And that one job is to send information. That's what it does, and interpret information. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of tissues. So when you think of nervous tissue or neural tissue, there's really two types of tissue involved. There's the neurons, which are like the stars of the show. The neurons are what actually take information in and send it somewhere else. So think of the neurons as the actual communication device. But we also have these other cells called neuroglial cells. And neuroglial cells are equally important to the neurons. Now, do they do the same job as the neurons do? No, they don't. But if they're not there, the neurons can't do their job. Actually, about half of the tissue in your brain, if you were to take all the cells in your brain, about half of them are going to be neurons, and the other half are going to be neuroglial cells. So we know they're obviously very important. And they're there to support the neurons, and they have a lot of different jobs. So we're going to dive in deep on neuroglial cells as we go through this unit. What's the job of your nervous system? Well, your nervous system really has three main jobs, and we have three main types of neurons. There's sensory, motor, and integrative neurons. So those words tell you a little bit about what they do. So when you think of your senses, right, we have five senses: sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing, right? And that is how our body takes in information from the outside world. That's the only way we can take information from the outside world. So when we react to our environment, we're taking it in through our sensory neurons. So that's the job of your sensory nervous system. It takes information from the inside and outside world, inside your body and outside of it, and it takes that information and it sends it to the brain or different parts of the body to be interpreted. We have our motor neurons, and their job is to have the body react to stimuli. So sensory information goes in, motor goes out to the muscles of the body and to the glands and organs of the body. And then finally we have the integrative, and the integrative are the least understood and to me most interesting because these are the cells, the neurons that make up your brain and spinal cord. And they take information from the sensory neurons and they use it to come up with answers to questions. So this is where we take information from the sensory motor neurons and we produce things like thought, right? Which, if I tell everybody to think of something right now, we can all do it. And that's an amazing thing, right? Creativity, to create something, memory, all these things that are brain function that we take for granted for the most part, that is all done by our integrative neurons. So we have sensory, information in, motor, information out, and then the integrative is where that information gets processed. There are two main divisions of your central nervous system. We're going to be focusing on just neurons in this unit. So we're not going to really be focusing on either one of these in particular. We're going to be talking about how does a neuron function. In the next unit, we're going to kind of dive in on what we call the central nervous system. And the central nervous system really is composed of two things, your brain and your spinal cord. And in reality, they are one unit. The brain and the spinal cord are connected to each other. So the brain has an extension coming off of the bottom, the brainstem, which is the extension of the spinal cord, and that is how the brain communicates with the body. I always like to say, think of your brain as being trapped in this little tiny room, dark, silent. There's nothing going on. And the only way that the brain is able to get information is from the neurons sending information in. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves that connect to the central nervous system and go out to the body. So you've all heard of spinal nerves before, right? So your spinal cord goes down your vertebral column, and then it branches off, and we have spinal nerves that go off to the different muscles in your body and the different glands and organs, and that is how our body communicates with our brain. I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture just getting into the anatomy of a neuron. So we're going to start going through a neuron and what it looks like and some of the major components of it. And I probably won't get through the entire anatomy of the neuron. I'll probably have a second lecture to finish that up. So let's get started. Well, this is a neuron here. You've all seen probably an image of a neuron before. They don't all look like this, but this is the most common type of neuron in the body. It is what we call a multipolar neuron. And I'm going to go into more detail about what that means a little later on in this unit. But for right now, we can just know that this is going to be your most common type of neuron. And what is the job of your neuron? Well, the neuron really has one job. And as complex as it is in how it does that job, what it does is actually very simple. It takes information from over here and sends it over here. That's it. It's a long, basically telephone, which goes from the brain out to the body, and then from the body back to the brain, which is going to trigger reactions. And it does that both chemically and electrically. So it's a complex process, don't get me wrong, not to say that a neuron is a simple thing. But what it does is rather simple. It's as simple as you calling up your mom and telling her that you need to get picked up at school, right? You call, you send a message, your mom picks up that message, and then hopefully she comes and picks you up at school, right? That is what's going on here, where we have our information over here, and it's either going to be sent over here, or it's possibly going to be prevented from going that direction. And we're going to get more into that a little bit later. But what I want to do for the rest of the lecture today is just go into some of the anatomy of what you see here. So let's get started. The first thing I'll point out to you are these little extensions at what I'm going to call the receiving end of the neuron. And these are called the dendrites. Dendrite actually means tree, and that is why they call them dendrites. They kind of look like tree branches, right? So the dendrites branch off of this main part of the cell, which is called the cell body. So this is called the cell body. It's also sometimes called the soma, S-O-M-A. You might see that written down in some textbooks, but they're the same thing. So the one thing I want you to remember is this is a cell, right? So just like any cell, it has a nucleus, it has endoplasmic reticulum, it has Golgi bodies, it has ribosomes, all those things you learn about in biology class. This also has those because it's a cell, but it's a specialized cell, and it has this long extension coming off of it called an axon. And that is the big difference between this type of cell and, let's say, any other epithelial cell in the body. It has a nucleus, it has, and we're going to talk more about what's contained in here, but at this point what we've talked about is the fact that there are dendrites that are attached to the cell body, and then also attached to the cell body we'll have this long extension called an axon. And it's different in every type of cell. Some axons are, micrometers in length because they're in your brain and they're tightly packed. And some of your axons are up to 1 meter in length because you have a neuron that leaves your spinal cord and goes all the way down your leg to the bottom of your foot. You've probably heard of it before. It's called your sciatic nerve. A lot of people suffer from sciatica. So that is one cell with a really long axon. So an axon can be extremely long, but that is how it sends impulses. So again, up to this point, we have our cell body, which is right here, which is where the nucleus is, and that is the main, I guess you could say, part of the cell body. And then attached to that, we have two extensions. We have the dendrites, which is information coming into the cell. So think of those as the receiving end. And then we have the axon, which is an extension coming off of the cell body, which is going to be sending. So that's going to be the sending part of the neuron. And this is going to send information to some other part of the body. It might be another neuron, it might be a muscle, it might be a gland, but it's going somewhere. Let's talk a little bit more about what we see happening on this neuron. One thing you'll notice is this axon is not completely nude, I guess you could say. It's covered up, right? It's got these little blobby looking guys on there. And those are extremely important. They are called Schwann cells. Now, what is a Schwann cell? A Schwann cell is actually a type of cell. It's one of the neuroglial cells you can think of. And the Schwann cells, or Schwann, depending on if you're German or not, I guess, they wrap around the axon, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it, right? Imagine you put your arm out and all of a sudden this little creature wraps around your arm and it just stays there because this is another cell entirely. It's part of the neuron because it's attached to it, but it's actually its own independent cell which has wrapped tightly around the axon. And what they do is they provide a form of insulation. So if you've ever seen wiring, like if you were to go to your house right now and pull out one of your outlets, what you would notice is there's wires in there, right? And those wires aren't exposed. They have a rubber coating on the outside which protects them, right? It insulates them and it allows the impulse to travel through the wire to go where it needs to go. So think of your Schwann cells as being like the insulation around the axon. These axons stretch a far distance and they have to send an impulse a long distance, and they do it in a matter of milliseconds. The speed at which a neuron is able to send its information is 100% dependent on these Schwann cells. They allow the impulse to travel down the axon. And I'm going to go into way more detail on how they do that later in the unit, but for right now you just need to know that these Schwann cells are going to actually act as a form of insulation which allows the impulse to figuratively jump down the axon to the bottom. And there's a term for that. We call it the myelin sheath, M-Y-E-L-I-N. And myelin is a fatty substance that is inside the Schwann cells. So the Schwann cells wrap around the axon and they are full of a fat called myelin. It's a triglyceride, it's just a fat, and if you know anything about fat, it's white and it's really good at insulating. That's what it does. It holds on to energy, but it also insulates. So it forms this thing called the myelin sheath, which is going to be an extension coming off of the axon, and it wraps around the axon, I should say, and it speeds up the rate at which that impulse can travel. And then finally on the slide, we have the axon terminals, and that is what we call the end of the axon. And these have these little basically bulbous ends, and they are what are going to form the neuromuscular junction. So you may remember from the muscle unit, the neuromuscular junction is the junction between the motor neuron and the muscle cell, right? So this is where that junction would occur. One of these little neurons would branch off and it would attach to a muscle or to a gland. There's another name for when it branches off. They also call these collaterals. So collaterals are the names for the branched when the axon branches off and goes different directions. So just to summarize what you see on the slide, I should say, this is our axon. Information gets sent from over here to over here. It goes in through the dendrites, so the dendrites pick up the information. The cell body is where we have the main cell parts, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria. They're found throughout the cell, but this is where they're concentrated. And then we have the axon coming off of the cell body as well, and that is what sends the information to another part of the body. There are these Schwann cells which wrap around the axon, which are full of this fatty substance called myelin, and we refer to this as the myelin sheath, and they're important because they allow the impulse to travel down the axon at the speed at which they need to travel. And then finally, we have our axon terminals. They're also called boutons, and they are at the end of the axon, and they are what actually are going to synapse with either another neuron or a muscle cell or a gland. We'll continue with the anatomy of a neuron in another lecture. Thank you.